Okay, so everyone, welcome to today's webinar. A couple of notes today. My name is Mike Peterson. I'm going to be moderating the webinar. You can see me in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to send me a chat. This webinar, as a reminder, will be recorded. The playback for this webinar will be posted on our website. I'll go ahead and post that URL in the chat as well. And we do encourage questions. So if you have questions, use your Q&A box, and Dr. Trina Spencer will monitor that, and she'll periodically answer those questions for us. And then also, if you'll stick around for the end of the webinar, there will be a discount provided if anyone is interested in any of the products being discussed today. So with that being said, I will turn the time over to Dr. Trina Spencer.
All right. Hello, everybody. We're going to get started with this. We have a limited time and there's a lot to cover. All right, so I chose the topic today of help all kids beat high stakes tests. You're going to find out why I chose that in a few minutes. Before we go into the content just a little bit, I need to, hold on a second. There we go. I just want to point out Doug Peterson. He's my partner in crime. So he and I both developed the Story Champs curriculum and the other materials that go with our whole MTSS system. So I just want to make sure that you knew him, and I think you can see me in the video box. We have a short poll to get to know you just a little bit. I want to make sure I know who I'm talking to. And I'm going to launch the poll right now. Everybody, will you please answer this question? Click on the one that describes your Story Champs use, okay? So go ahead and do that. Take just 30 seconds. Either you are a frequent, extensive user or just a little bit, you're interested in trying it, or you know nothing about Story Champs or what it is. That'll help me know who my audience is while we're going through this webinar. Pretty good. 77% of you have voted. Okay, we're waiting on a couple more people. Hey, Mike, if somebody raises their hand, are you monitoring that?
Yes, so typically if you have a question, go ahead and put that in the Q&A. I do see we have a couple of hands raised, so I will send a chat message to them. Thank you.
Okay. All right, good. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and let's find out who everybody is. So in terms of our results, it looks like, you know, almost half of you have used Story Champs just a little bit, and 8 of you have used Story Champs frequently and extensively, which is awesome. And then the rest of you, the other half, are interested in getting to know it. And, you know, really that's kind of the purpose of this webinar, is to help people get to know what Story Champs is and what it can do for you. I did take a look at the audience description when you signed up for the webinar, so I know who most of you are. There's a good chunk of speech language pathologists on the webinar. There's also a number of teachers and administrators and even some university faculty. So that's kind of our audience. All right. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about high stakes tests. We're going to start there. This is a cute little comic that basically says anybody who doesn't look like these nice little round people, right, to fill out this bubble test are in trouble. And guess what? That's exactly right. So I'm going to step you through some examples of a high stakes test. I live in Florida right now, and all the 3rd graders take the Florida State Assessment, and my daughter happens to be in 3rd grade, so she's very stressed out about this test. And I just, you know, was looking at some of the practice samples, and I thought, you know what, this is exactly the kind of things that Story Champs is designed to improve. But we work on these things far in advance, long before they have to do well on these standardized tests. And, you know, of course, I just had to remind my daughter, hey, this is Story Champs stuff, you know this, and she was a little calmer about it. All right, so what I've got is some practice tests. This here is a question that comes off of the ELA practice test for the Florida State Assessment that third graders would be administered. What comes before this are two narrative passages. Really, they're two short stories. And the story is about a man who's traveling into a market to sell some cheese. And when he stops along the road, it's a hill, so he has to walk down the hill. But when he stops along the way, sits down his bag, the cheese comes out of his bag and rolls down the hill. And he makes the assumption that the cheese can make it to the market on their own, okay? So what I'm gonna show you here are some elements that you're going to see later how Story Champs addresses. And I just selected some of the items on this FSA exam or this high stakes test, but there were others that would also illustrate my point. So right here, what's underlined is the question is asking why the man believes his cheese can bring themselves to the market. And it's really referring to the problem of this story, all right? And there are some inferences that have to be made in order for the child to answer this question correctly. So other questions in this test are describing the man's feelings, right? So there might be some inferences that need to be made. And then this part B is what happens in the passage because of the man's feelings. So we're looking at causal relations between the man's feelings, the problem, and probably what's happening at the end. So this question is asking about an emotion word or, you know, a vocabulary word. So what's the meaning of anxious in this sentence? In this one, this particular question is asking about the main character's problem. It just happens to be that paragraph 16 is what I described to you before when the man sits down his satchel and the cheese came out. So that's the beginning of the main character's problem, okay? Now this one is a information type passage, but it's set in a narrative structure, even though it's kind of a combo, it's a hybrid, which is very common in third grade actually. So you're giving a lot of information, but also setting it in a story-like discourse. So I have underlined a few things that I want you to pay attention to. For one, the words underlined in blue are hard words. These are what we might consider less common words or vocabulary words that fall under the category of maybe a tier 2. They are maybe moderate frequency, but children don't use them. Some of them also could be tier 3 words like the Panama Canal or reserve or fertilizer. And tier 3 words would mean that they're less common words and they're only, or low frequency words that are only used within a particular domain, like in science, okay? So there's a lot of heavy words in this passage. There's also a lot of adjectives. These are in purple. I just underlined some of them, but there are many adjectives in here. And children would have to understand what this means, like the day's work, or what ordinary means. Leaf cutting, does that describe ants? Children would have to know this. I really like this: tropical research and biological reserves. These are phrases that would be difficult for children who may not have strong oral language skills. I underlined green. These are complex language structures. These are syntactical features that are complex. So this includes a subordinate clause in both of these examples. Now this word healthy in orange, the reason why I underlined it is because it goes with this sentence. It looks fine and healthy. And healthy, a child may know the meaning of healthy in the context of a person, but what they're talking about is a garden. What does that mean? So it's really metaphorical, or it has it has a gradation of a meaning. Right, so it could be very challenging to some kids. And to continue, there's I underlined a couple other syntactic features that are in this section of the passage. These are complex syntax and sentence structures that are difficult for children to understand. Some of the questions that are related to this passage was asking specifically about the main idea. This one is asking what the word means, the word weave means. Again, the gradations of words comes into play here because none of the primary definition of weave is in the options here. So it's a secondary definition of weave, and they have to use the context to figure it out. So this one is asking for the evidence that supports the main idea, which would be some sort of key detail. and it's part of the passage structure. These ones, this is after the information passage, and this is the final part of the FSA English Language Arts exam. So here, the child has to, in the sentence, figure out what kind of grammatical ending goes with the word frown, right? So Sam and his mother began to practice spelling. Sam frowned. So it's testing whether the child can understand the past tense that is occurring in the previous sentence, began. Okay, and then in the next one is looking at whether there is pronoun cohesion and whether the child can decipher that, which can be complex. Okay, so my point in showing you all of that is that we want to get to high stakes tests, right? We want children to be successful there. But in order to get there, we cannot start there. We have to start much, much earlier and in a much more simple place. We need to start with oral narrative language comprehension and expression, and advance on top of that to expository language, and then on top of that, written narrative and written expository language. So while these are not perfectly sequenced, these labels that I have here, they're not perfectly sequenced. They are generic in that there is a development for these things and that some need to happen before. And if we try to have kids do those high stakes tests and do not have good narrative language skills, they're going to have a really hard time with that. So I'm not the only one that thinks this. There's lots of smart people, and I have a few quotes. I could talk about these things, but sometimes these quotes are very powerful and they say them very, very well. So this one is, early language disadvantage persists and manifests itself as illiteracy when educational practices fail to recognize the importance of oral language. One of the things that I love about this quote is that it doesn't talk about children failing, because children are not failing. It's the educational practices that are failing them, right? Our practices haven't kept up to and haven't been adapted to support the needs of the kids. So in this one, if literacy levels are to improve, the aims of the English language arts classroom, especially in the earliest grades, must include oral language in a purposeful, systematic way. Every time I read this, I want to say oral language in a powerful, systematic way. And that's also true. We need to be very powerful, and we need to do the instruction with these young kids in a way that's going to create the biggest bang for their buck. And notice this is a quote that comes straight out of the Common Core State Standards. And I don't always promote the Common Core State Standards. However, I do appreciate how much attention they have on oral language skills. And it really comes from there that's influencing all the states to think more about oral language skills as the foundation for more written language and information. So the research strongly suggests that English language arts classroom should explicitly address the link between oral and written language. And here's my favorite part: exploiting the influence of oral language on a child's later ability to read by allocating instructional time to building children's listening skills as called for in the standards. So I really love that, exploiting the influence of oral language. I think, generally speaking, people realize that oral language is important, but we don't really take advantage of it. We don't say, yes, that's what we need to do. Okay. So this is a matrix, a four-square that comes out of the Common Core State Standards Appendix for English Language Arts. And it simply represents that receptive language, whether it's oral and written, are closely aligned and are highly correlated. And the expressive language, whether it's speaking or writing, is highly correlated. So, and listening and speaking come before reading and writing. The focus on oral language is of greatest importance for the children most at risk. Children for whom English is a second language and children who have not been exposed at home to the kind of language found in written texts. This is very important. So most of us know that there is a reading crisis, but do we know that 2 out of 3 children, all children, are not reading on grade level in the 4th grade? That seems like a serious crisis. That is too many children to be failing. And is it the children who are failing, or is it our education system that's failing our children? And then to reemphasize this, that children who are culturally diverse, if they are a minority, African American, Hispanic, Native American, the percent of children who are not reading on grade level in the 4th grade is actually 80%. So only 20% of kids are proficient readers if they're a minority, 20% of culturally, linguistically diverse kids. If English is a second language to them, it's actually worse. Only 10% of the kids are actually reading on grade level in the 4th grade. So that seems to be a pretty serious problem. Now, I haven't mentioned children with disabilities. But we know that they're in here as well. And it is their oral language difficulties that are going to prevent them from being successful in reading and writing tasks in later grades. And when I get more into Story Champs, you're going to see that Story Champs was designed to be useful across all children. It's not designed just for kids with disabilities, and it's not designed just for English language learners or for typical kids. It can work with all of them, and I'll demonstrate how that will work. All right. Ensuring all children in the United States have access to excellent education requires that issues of oral language come to the fore in elementary classrooms. And so I'm not just talking about middle and high school, and I'm really not talking about them. I'm really talking about elementary classrooms. And this is my favorite quote: academic language is the pivotal skill repertoire for closing the achievement gap, and attention to it is nearly absent in primary grades. This is just unconscionable. We know that academic language is going to make a huge difference, yet we're not seeing it happen. And in fact, because so many kindergarten and 1st grade teachers are being, what's the right word, influenced or persuaded or coerced into focusing on their decoding skills, they've stopped reading books to kids. They've stopped having language-rich conversations. I've had many kindergarten teachers, admit that they're not reading to their kids like they used to. So I just want to briefly mention academic language, and then I'm going to pause to see if there's some other questions. When I say academic language, I mean more than just domain vocabulary. So there's some different definitions of what we mean by academic language. Some people think academic language is just informational, like expository kind of language, or that it's just written, or that's just vocabulary, but that's not the definition that we have. And the quotes that I mentioned, they're coming from people who share the same definition of academic language. It is the language used in school to help students acquire and use knowledge. It's oral and written, and it involves vocabulary. And I already mentioned the kinds of vocabulary we might be including under that category, which would be like tier 2 words, which are moderate frequency, that are used across domains, but children seldom use them. And then low frequency words that are specific to domains, like science words like organism, okay? Those would be more tier 3 words. Those would be the domain specific words. So also included in this umbrella of academic language would be complex syntax. So some of the things that I pointed out in the passages from the 3rd grade Florida State assessment, those would be considered complex syntax, right? And that's also academic language. Sometimes we call that literate language, and I have a slide later that's going to explore that a little bit further. And then we also have genres that would fall under academic language, and we would include both narrative and informational discourses, as opposed to conversation. So conversation does not necessarily have complex language in it. It does not necessarily use academic vocabulary words. And so we would contrast academic language to conversation. Okay, I'm going to stop right there and see if anybody has a question about anything I've covered so far.
Trina, it looks like we have a question from Amber. She's asking if we will get a copy of the slides.
So, will she?
So the answer is yes, Will. That's a great question. We will provide those slides with the recording of the webinar, and those will be posted on our website. I will post that link near the end of the webinar.
Okay. Good. Anything else? Okay, I'll move along. Wait, did you have something, Mike?
Nope, no other questions.
Okay. All right, so I I haven't said too much about decoding, and I haven't given you too many details here, but here's my summary of this. This is what educators should be doing. They should be promoting language with the same vigor as they do decoding. And they should begin as soon as children enter school and sustain a focus on language into college. Because colleges are saying that children do not read and write as well as they should when they're coming into college. And that's why they have all those remedial courses and when children are when they're freshmen. They're not really children by that time. Anyway, the teachers should be teaching the most essential academic language skills. And importantly, the teachers have the right to have access to the tools they need to differentiate for all learners. It's really unfair for people, or I guess publishers and researchers, to expect teachers to be able to use a different set of curriculum for like all the different kids that are in their class. They need something that's kind of a one size fits all, that's going to work for all of them so that they can differentiate based on the needs. So we focus on narrative language, and I'm just going to cover some reasons why that is the case. In Story Champs, it is a narrative intervention program, and we use narratives as the basis because they are the most salient and easiest for children. So all children experience stories in their lives, whether adults are reading books to them. But of course, they're going to experience more if adults are reading books to them. In contrast, not all children are exposed to informational discourses, unless somebody's lecturing about a science topic, which probably happens in upper class families where the parents are highly educated. But that isn't happening with all kids. This is especially true for kids raised in poverty. And they may infrequently experience stories, but they pretty much never experience informational discourse. So as a result, they're more familiar with story structures. They may, so life also, whether or not they hear stories, their life is experienced in stories. Our lives have characters, settings, problems, emotions, and solutions. So it doesn't really matter whether they are hearing books or hearing stories. Their own lives are set in the structure of stories. And we also should never begin teaching something difficult by starting with the most difficult concepts. We first learn to ride a bike using training wheels, and we first learn to play a simple piece on the piano before a more complex concert piece. So narratives are like the academic training wheels, and they're perfectly suited for it. We can properly build on what the children already know and what they can learn in a simple story, right? And then we can relate the stories to them, and they can have background experiences that help the content in stories be readily accessible and benefit for them. We also use narratives because children can learn the complex language that is transportable to informational texts, right? Making the complex language within informational discourse easier to learn because they've already had exposure in a narrative and more comfortable genre. The same is true when we move from oral to written. So narratives have been considered a bridge between oral and written language because they have shared features like these on this list here. These are complex language structures or features that you most often see in books, whether it's narrative or informational. And these are the kind of features that are also considered literate language. And literate language is literate because it shows up in books, but it also happens in oral narratives. So one of the things that's really important here is that through the oral medium, the brain, for young children, has space to learn something because they're not focusing on decoding. So children do not readily get oral language benefits during decoding or phonics tasks in kindergarten and first grade because their brain and their cognitive power is being spent on decoding. Therefore, we should be working on language or language comprehension in the absence of decoding, even when they're in kindergarten and first grade. Okay. So we contend that oral narrative language is the foundation for all of these things, for vocabulary, informational discourse, reading comprehension, domain knowledge, and writing. You cannot write what you cannot say, okay? And that if you have a strong narrative base, and we work on that with children, the acquisition of these other academic language skills will be more efficient. And we have seen this many times in our work. It's very rewarding to be able to teach something so well that give them a strong foundation that they can acquire these other things very rapidly. So without an oral narrative base, children do not have structure of stories to use in writing or understand what they read. Without an oral narrative base, they cannot understand complex sentences. Without an oral narrative base, they do not realize that there are patterns in informational discourse, as well as they don't know how to listen to and recognize them. And without an oral narrative base, new vocabulary and domain knowledge is difficult to acquire because their brains are working overtime to understand the discourse structure. So only when their brains are not already at capacity can they acquire word meanings and domain knowledge. Okay, so it brings us to Story Champs. Okay, so Story Champs. It is a multi-tiered language intervention curriculum. And I did not include the word academic language, but it is an academic language program if you want it to be. It also could be just a basic, simple communication intervention where you're teaching children to tell about events. The program itself was created from our research, from Doug and my research, and for our research. We were both clinicians coming into our research training programs interested in improving reading comprehension. And of course, we didn't start with third grade, we started with young kids. And so Story Champs was developed through several of our studies. And at the end, I'll show you where a summary of our research is. So Story Champs is a manualized program, but it's highly flexible. And that's kind of like the greatest thing about it and also the worst thing about it. I'll touch on that a little bit later too. So there are three key features that make Story Champs effective. One is that we have carefully structured stories. The stories are very important. They are designed for instruction purposes. They're not for entertainment or, you know, for book reading. They're for instruction. We have engaging visual materials to enhance the active responding, and then explicit teaching procedures. So while it's very explicit, we use these stories that are quite authentic, right? Which means that it's fun. Kids generally like it, and teachers don't have a problem with it either. All right, so I'm going to be showing you some of these carefully structured stories so you understand that these are just not stories you can pull off the shelf. How they're structured are very purposeful. Oh, these are colorful visual materials. Sorry, I forgot this slide was in here before the stories. So here you see the materials. There's a storybook. There are illustrations that are not too detailed. We use brightly colored icons, and then there's lots of games. This thing over here is Champ Checks, where we do peer tutoring, and then games where kids can play while they're listening to a friend. And the story starter cards are a new addition this last year, and they're super fun. I'll show you how to use them in a few minutes. And then if you happen to be a Story Champs 1.0 user, that is out of print. But if you want all the benefits of all the new stuff that is in the Story Champs 2.0, these are the materials that that come with a booster pack to bump you up to the 2.0. And one of the things that is an added bonus of this 2.0 is all these extra things that come on the flash drive. And I'll talk more about those in a few minutes. Okay, so here's the stories. Here's the table of contents. And there are two types of stories that we've structured. So classic stories and blitz stories. So classic stories are really designed for your entry-level kids, maybe kids with disabilities, young children, 3- and 4-year-olds who do not really have a strong narrative structure already. We find that narrative structure is quite easy for children to learn, and they can learn to retell a story pretty fast. But if they are young or they have disabilities, they might need more time doing that. And the level A and B stories of the classic stories are designed for that. So in other words, we didn't fill it full of too many academic language features so that they could focus on learning story structure. And in level A, they would work on the basic story structure, which is 5 parts. We always present a story with 5 parts: character, problem, feeling, action, and ending. And then level B would add the setting and the end feeling. So when they've been able to do the level A stories, you can bump them up to level B stories. The blitz stories have a bunch of stuff packed in them. That's why they're called blitz. So we have vocabulary words, we have words that they can learn from context, we have causal connections, and many other features. We also have a bilingual storybook. So we have a bilingual edition of Story Champs, so it's also in Spanish and English. It's really great for cross-linguistic transfer. So here is an example of a classic story. Classic stories are 68 to 70 words. They have, you know, just those 5 features, and the icons along the bottom are help with the targeting of those story structure pieces. Now, the linguistic targets that are embedded here is a because, then, and when, and we're very careful about that. Every story has a then, every story has a because, and every story has either an after or a when. And those tend to be the later developing of this in this developmental element, or in this particular point in the sequence. Now, if you wanted to work on vocabulary, you can. You just have to add it to the story, okay? And that's what's different in the classic story. So down here in the lower right-hand corner, there is vocabulary. This is a Blitz level A story. So this one, the vocabulary is already embedded into the story. So you can see that gulped and delectable are in the story, and you have clues, we call them contextual support, to have the children figure out what the meaning of it is. So there's also because it's a level A, it's the 5 story grammar parts, and we use this sparkle icon that's over here on the right with the stars on it to denote that there's a vocabulary word to use. There are other bigger words in here, but they do not have contextual support. So you can't infer the meaning of those words. You'd have to actually define them for the kids and let them practice them. Okay, so when we do a level A story, we use 5 illustrations. There's 5 panels and those 5 main parts of the story, and gulped and delectable were the sparkle words that are on, so that there's sparkle icons over that particular illustration panel. So this is it's a level B Blitz story. It's the same story, but it's written in a more complex fashion. So you see that there is a setting icon and an end feeling icon, and the target vocabulary words are actually different than in the previous story. So you can work on different words depending on the level that your story structure is targeted. Okay, so a level C story has an emphasis on the causal subordination. So we have because and so that blitzed in this story. So they're planted in there so that the child gets many opportunities to hear and use causal subordination. So this one has temporal subordination, level D. In level I, they're starting to mix. So we have modifiers and causal and temporal connections. And then there's a level J, which is a double episode. It has a lot. This is as long as the stories get, really. A level J would be most appropriate for 3rd grade and up. It has a double episode, meaning that the first attempt to solve the problem did not work, and so we have an unresolved problem. But the second attempt does. And there's many vocabulary words that are embedded in here and lots of complex literate language. So you can just get a taste for how you can select a story based on the instructional targets that you're interested in. And that's why they're carefully controlled. Okay, I'm going to answer a question really quick because one came up, and it's so funny because I even was about to say this, that the Spanish lesson, so the question is, are the stories in Spanish translations of the English edition? So the answer to that is yes, these ones are. These ones are actual translations, and we spent probably 3 years trying out the translations and revising them with many speakers of different dialects. And the only restriction that they had in the translation is that the illustrations had to work for them. So the same illustrations are used in the English as they are in the Spanish. And so we had a lot of very skilled Spanish speakers do the translations. And the primary author of those is a woman who has a Ph.D. in applied linguistics from the States, but she's Mexican. And so anyway, and we had other individuals read the stories. I'm not sure they're perfect. I don't speak Spanish, so it's hard for me to make that judgment. But one of the ways that we've seen the Spanish lessons be used is in a bilingual immersion program where half the day was in English and half the day was in Spanish. And the teachers would use the same story in the same day. So half the kids were Spanish L1 and half the kids were English L1, and they would get the opposite lessons. And so they built a cross-linguistic transfer. And what's nice about it is that the vocabulary are the same. So the sentences may be very different, but generally about the illustrations, but the vocabulary is still in there. So they would get the same word in English as they would in Spanish. Here, Story Champs was designed to be a tiered intervention. And what I mean by that is that there's alignment between these tiers. So what gets taught and the teaching approach in large group or with the whole class is similar to what gets taught and the approach in small group and individual. What that does for kids who are struggling is they actually get an intensified version, not a totally different version of an intervention, right? So that there is some alignment between them and we don't confuse the kids who are struggling the most. To intensify, the parameters that change are the opportunities to respond, right? There are more opportunities for children to respond when you have one-on-one instruction or small group than in a whole class. You can be more explicit and more individualized in the targets with a smaller group. You can have more specialized prompting, more contingent feedback. Now you can also change the frequency of sessions or increase the duration of the sessions to intensify something, and also rely on instructors with greater expertise. So I would guess that doing an intervention with a speech language pathologist might be more intense than a paraprofessional, simply because they know more about language and can be more purposeful and intentional about the intervention than they're giving. So the characteristics of the Story Champs instruction is based on the effective teaching literature and principles of instruction. We use multiple exemplar training. And what this means is that across the stories, we're teaching the same structure, and the structure of stories emerges. And so the children learn this more meta-linguistic or metacognitive level of story, or the structure of stories across exemplar. We don't repeat the stories in the instruction, at least not consecutively, so that they don't memorize the stories. The point is not to memorize stories. The point is to learn language. The point is to learn the structure of stories and the language used when telling stories, which is a higher level metacognitive or metalinguistic skill. And that's achieved through multiple exemplars. And there are 24 instructional stories in Story Champs with 10 different levels of stories, what I showed you before, from A to J. So we also have active responding games and peer tutoring. So these are some examples of the games that children would play while they're listening to their friend. And in the Champ Checks, kids do a peer tutoring piece where they would tutor each other and listen to the other kid's story and help them if they need help. We also have corrections and explicit, flexible, and individualized targets. That's actually comes out when we have lesson plans. Sorry, this slide, I want to show this slide. On the jump drive, or the flash drive that comes with the Story Champs, is the lesson plans. And we call them master lesson plans because they can be quite flexible and they give you an outline of steps. And you can choose lesson plans based on the size of your group. Is it a large group? Is it a small group? Is it individual? There are 57 master lesson plans. When I say 57, I mean 57 different ways to teach those lessons. And then there are 8 add-on lessons. That means that you can insert a particular step to make this lesson plan have more of something else, and I'm going to show you in a minute. So here would be the table of contents for the large group. Notice that you could start with basic story structure in Master Lesson Plan 1 with just the retells, and all the way down to, let's say, Master Lesson Plan 12, which is the advanced story structure when there's a double episode, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you can customize the instruction that you give a kid. And some similar things happen with the small group and individually, right? So I've taken the time to go through them so that you're getting the nuts and bolts of what you need. This is what a master lesson plan looks like. This one here, small group 25, is one of the most popular. All right, and this one on the left would be basic story structure, and this one on the right would be the enhanced story structure with the setting and the end feeling. They all have this basic this format where the add-on lesson is in the blue rectangle kind of at the top. You could consider any of those add-on lessons. It tells you what materials you need, where to look for them. And this is an example of my favorite add-on lesson. It's called Blitz Vocabulary Words from Context. In here, you see it tells you what icons you need. This is an optional, the word journal, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. And then what story to choose and which master lesson plan that these would go through. So this is also on your on the flash drive under printables. And so when children are learning, the words that are in the story, see that procedure right there? It says clue finding number 3. So this is the strategy we use to help children figure out the meaning of words. But once they figured out the meaning of the word, they can then use the word journal to write the word, write some synonyms, definitions, and example sentences so that they get more practice with those words. Another way that we extend the practices is what's called Spot the Sparkle. So we call vocabulary words that we're trying to teach kids that are in the stories, we call them sparkle words. And kids really love it. As a matter of fact, when my daughter was in 1st grade and we were trying out some of these lessons, she'd come home from school and say, "Mom, quiz me on sparkle words." I'd be like, "Okay, you're crazy, but I'm glad I have you." But this particular thing that you're seeing here is a poster. Sorry. This is a poster. You would laminate it, you put it in the classroom. And one of the standards talks about learning gradations of vocabulary. And what we have is a synonym word cloud so that kids can learn different synonyms for a target word. So cluttered is actually in story 13. The little Bryn, she cleaned her cluttered room. Okay, so then we could talk about the synonyms, and then how it works is throughout the week, the children in the classroom should be spotting sparkle words. So they are on the lookout and trying to use the word cluttered or any of the others in the word cloud, or when they see it in a book or when they hear somebody use it, they would come and they would be able to write a tally mark in the white piece with a dry erase marker. So it's a game. Okay, so on the flash drive is the digital story champs. And it looks a little bit like that. It's pretty awesome because you can actually display all the illustrations and the icons on a smart board or on an iPad or anything like that. So this is the kind of the index page. You click on one of the stories, it might look like this. And then you use a click and drag. You can do it if it's a touch screen, you can click and drag the icons on there so that kids have some tactile and activity with it. These are story starter cards, and these are the recent addition to the program. We use these to teach children how to generate fictional stories. We also have been using them recently on how to make inferences, right? So I can show some kids this little monkey with the banana and say, what do you think his problem is? And how do you think he feels about it? So walking them through some questioning where they can piece together. And then you can ask him, well, how do you know he's sick? Right? How do you know he ate too many bananas? So somebody asked about the Story Champs 2 or 1.0. So there is a booster kit if you are interested in boosting your 1.0 so that you can have the icons, the sparkle icons, as well as the story starter cards. And there's a new storybook and the master lesson plans are all in the booster kit, okay? So this is an example of a writing lesson plan, so lesson 37 that you would use with the story starter cards. And you can do it a number of ways, and we have lots of materials to help writing. So you can do it where each kid gets a different story starter card, or the whole class or the whole small group is doing generating the same story using the same story starter card. We also have organizers, advanced organizers. So there's the picture boxes, then there's rough draft, there's a final draft, and then we teach kids to score and evaluate their own and others' writing work. Now, information retail, this is also a new piece, but some of our recent research has been using information retell lessons, and they've been very, very successful. Now, I just wanted to punctuate what I mentioned before, is I would not start on information retell or information writing until children have a strong narrative base. And I had a first grade teacher once say to me, no, 50% of what I have the kids do has to be information. I said, but 100% of your kids are not ready for 50% informational discourse. And she was like, but, and I said, let's work on this narrative stuff. And so we spent 6 months, we worked on narratives very, very well, and then transitioned into information in the second half of the year. And she was like, oh my gosh, I totally get it. Those kids would have died. They would have drowned if I was working on information in the fall, right? Because they did not have a strong narrative base. So these information retell lessons are pretty fun. Let me show you an example of one. We also recommend, so we do not have information passages in the Story Champs 2.0, and that's because we should be using information that is coming from the kids' grade level curriculum, right? So you work with the teacher and say, give me some of the materials that you're working on in science and social studies, and then you use a passage out of that, or you adapt it just a little bit. So this would be an example. This is actually first grade content. All organisms live in specialized environments called habitats. And if you notice, there's an icon there that's not quite a sparkle. This is called a new term. And these are their domain specific, or those tier 3 words. So habitat and environment, organism, these all are words that are specific to this domain. You know, obviously it's the point of the content. Habitats are perfect homes for plants and animals because everything they need to live and grow is there. By the way, the passage icons are the main idea, which is the big cloud, and then the small icons with the little clouds, they're called key details. One of the things that we have discovered is that we do not need to complicate children by teaching them a bunch of different information structures. This main idea and key detail actually works across different expository structures. So we can use it for compare and contrast, for sequencing, for everything, because there's always a hierarchy. There's always something, and then there's things that support it. The evidence is the key details, or not. So there's some more domain-specific words like flora and fauna. And then the tier 2, or the sparkle word in this, is actually thrive, because it works across, across domains, right? So we also have a second passage. You can do a second passage with the same kind of thing. And this one, the sparkle word is adapt, and things like climate, habitat, you know, temperature would be the tier 3 or the new terms. Okay. Another way to use these lessons is to read nonfiction books. So this is a book that I read with kids, and we stopped at this one page and we discussed this content. We looked at the words crust, mantle, what is the core, those kinds of things. And the children took notes. This is with older kids, so 2nd and 3rd graders. The thing on the upper right hand corner is a notes page, and that comes with the printables on the flash drive. So you teach children to write small little notes, and then instead of orally retelling, they can do what's called a writing retell. So on the lower left hand, they then write it. They write out what they heard and what they understand. So you're converting it to information writing quite quickly, but giving them supports along the way. So just couple quick things. These are additions that come with the program. There are take-home activities for levels A and B stories, and they are in English and in Spanish. For our younger kids, we want to involve the families, and so there are take-home activities. These are center activities for kindergarten and preschool students, where they would sequence cards. These are books that children would draw and then dictate to an adult. And then you could, you know, turn them into books, send them home with kids. Anyway, there's a bunch of those kinds of things on the flash drive. They're called under printables. Okay, so I'm gonna say here that if you're at all interested in using Story Champs, I want to urge you to read the manual. All right, I actually redid the manual this time around. It's very easy to use. I've got some pages there. There's fewer words, more illustrations, and they're very step by step. It is on the flash drive, right? So we didn't add cost to the program by printing out a manual. So it's on the flash drive and not. So when you are using the Story Champs 2.0, you would select a story, you'd select a lesson and a story. These are the procedures you would use. You have to identify what arrangement you would use, right? It's either large, small, or individual. You'd have to identify the targets and you use your assessment data to do that. Now there are lots of targets, right? You can target story structure. You always have to target something and decide whether it's basic, enhanced. Enhanced plus I didn't cover, but I don't think I really have time to do it, or advanced. You also want to know what genre. You want to do retells, personal, fictional, informational. You want story and information writing. There's lots of things to choose from. There are also different linguistic targets like causal connections, temporal connections, and modifiers. 4 types of vocabulary targets are classic, where the words are actually in there, but you have to define it for them. That's in the Blitz Explicit too. And then there's the contextual words where they can infer the meaning of the words. And then there's the new terms. Finally, you identify a specific master lesson plan or an add-on lesson that addresses the targets of interest. And I already mentioned that there are 57 master lesson plans. But the manual will help step you through this in a lot more detail so that you can have good direction about what to do. Okay, I'm going to stop. I'm going to leave it on this one and I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to answer a couple questions, okay? So somebody asked, how many times per week do you suggest doing group therapy sessions? So that's a great question. I'm just going to say the more is always better, but we have very intentionally in our research tested all different types of arrangements. So we have studies that says a group therapy that we do every day works, but we've also done it where the kids only received intervention once a week. So, and then we have somewhere in between 2 or 3 times a week. So we know that it all works, but you're going to see the gains commensurate with how the frequency and the intensity of the intervention. One of the things that we really like to see is a classroom teacher who's doing the large group intervention, and then the SLP or a resource teacher or an RTI specialist or something like that is pushing in to do small group interventions with the kids who are struggling the most. But it shouldn't supplant or replace the other instruction. They should get it on top of it. And then you can alternate that. So we might do 2 or 1 large group lesson a week, but 2 small group lessons to intensify it. Those are all possibilities. So I'm sorry, but there's no perfect answer to that, okay? One of the things, let's see. Okay, so somebody's asking me how long we spend on one story. The answer is 1 session, and you do not repeat the stories in consecutive times. And I want to punctuate a point that I made earlier is that the point with the story champs is not for them to learn the story. It is not about the story. It is about the meta-linguistic skills that they learn through the story. The story is simply an exemplar of the structure. Okay, so we do not repeat stories and we do not want them to memorize them. I don't even care that they get the information exactly right. What I care about is that they're lengthening the utterances and the complexity of the sentences that they use, and that they include all of the parts you're targeting. Like if it's a basic story structure, that they include a character, problem, feeling, action, and ending. That is more important than the details of the story. All right, so it would actually be counterproductive if you worked on a single story until they mastered that single story. Please don't do that, right? It's not designed like that. Let's see, I got others I gotta get on here. One of the things I do wanna say about the stories though, is that let's say you're working on a level A classic story. Go ahead and work on all 12 stories. So go from story 1 to story 2, story 3, and change each session. At the end of those 12 stories, go back to the beginning of the 12 stories. But this time around, work on something like language complexity or vocabulary. You don't need to work on story structure again, because, I mean, you would be expecting all the kids to do it anyway, but you can add on additional targets. So the second or the third time around, we call those cycles. You do instructional cycles. And if you do that, then they already have some part of that mastered, and you can work on the higher level skills, right? Without worrying about the parts that they have mastered. And that's also the reason why there's 10 different levels, so that you can move kids on as you need to go. How long does it take to work through wait, I missed a different question. Does it include a way to take regular consistent data for IEP goals? Oh, Absolutely. Unfortunately, that is a different webinar. I love that question though, but I am not addressing any assessment. Our assessment tools though are available for free on Language Dynamics Group, and it's called the Cubed. And within the Cube is the NLM, Narrative Language Measures Listening, and Narrative Language Measures Reading. And I would love to go into more detail, but I think you can find what you need on the website for free. And I guarantee you we'll have another webinar in a month or so that addresses the assessment piece alone. Okay, and how to do goals for IEPs. I have a lot of content on that. So how long does it take to go through the program? Well, let's hope it takes 5 years, really. So the program works for preschool to 3rd grade. And because there are, some combination of 65 different lesson plans, you would advance the difficulty of the lesson plan based on the language skills of that child. So if you start a child doing story champs in preschool or kindergarten, the next year they should be doing the higher level stories. And then they would be working on writing. They would be working on information, right? There's all these extensions of story champs that are going to last all the way to 3rd grade. Okay. And that really depends on, how intense they're getting it and their development in other areas. But there are hundreds of target vocabulary words in these stories, hundreds of them, and we never repeat them. So every story in the Blitz program has a set of 3 to 6 target vocabulary words. So over 24 stories, that's a lot of vocabulary that they can be learning. So there's a question about what comes on the flash drive. And the flash drive has a lot of printables. So it has the manual, it has the master lesson plans. And the reason why the master lesson plans are on there is because there's 65 of them. And a preschool teacher needs something different than a 3rd grade, an SLP who works with 3rd graders. And so you should be printing out the lesson plans. Maybe you would have like 2 to 5 different lesson plans you would work with your caseload or with your set of kids. And so you don't want to, I don't want to add a cost to you if you don't need all 65 of those pages. So you just print out the ones you need. And you can purchase that with the booster, all right? Or it does come with this 2.0, Story Champs 2.0, or you can do it with the booster pack. And those questions about purchasing can absolutely get answered by Mike. Okay, he's the best one to answer those things afterwards. He works for the company. I do the research. All right, I'm way behind on questions, but that's all right. I'm pretty much done with my content. So I'm gonna hit questions. So our whole group classroom instruction has been targeting 1 story a week for 3 days with a focus for each different day. Story structure, then causal language, then sparkle words. Are you suggesting not to do this since you are supposed to repeat the story? Not supposed to repeat the stories. Writing tasks more than 1 session to do usually, hoping to clarify. Okay, so writing tasks can be long. So ideally you would do the entire lesson within 1 session and no longer than 30 minutes. So if you're spending too much time on the writing lessons, then writing is the one thing that you could probably break up easily. So you do the oral components first and then into the writing. But it depends on which of the master lesson plans. But ideally you would get it down to 30 minutes or less. And yes, I have a question about, wait, I want to answer that question about the, that's funny, something's happening here, about how to repeat. So what I would recommend about the doing whole class instruction, my worry about doing it 3 times in the same week is simply that you might inadvertently teach kids that they're supposed to memorize the story, okay? And that's really counterproductive. So you can, what you're doing with the cycles where you teach story structure and then the language and then the sparkle words, I don't think that that's bad, but what you want to do is make sure you are not inadvertently teaching the kids that they have to memorize the story. So another way to do it is make sure that they've got story structure down. So you might do maybe, you know, you could do 3 to 6 weeks of just working on story structure, depending on how advanced your kids are. And if you're talking about like first, second, or third grade, they probably don't need to do story structure more than by itself, more than 1 or 2 lessons, right? But it depends on the level of your kids. So make sure they have story structure, and then I would immediately go into language complexity and vocabulary. Now, and I say that because if you've got typical kids and you're teaching it in a whole class, they're able to handle more because story structure is probably already set, right? So I don't know if I would spend 1 day every week to do it that way. Now, I am also giving you that based on my experience and having no idea what's going on in your class. I'm not looking at your assessment data. I'm not looking at the grade level of your students. So those are some additional considerations. And if you would like to talk to me more about that, I have my email address at the end. I would be happy to set up a conference call with you specifically because I'd like to hear more about how you feel like that's working for you. Okay. So one of my questions here is, can it work for older kids to fill in the gaps? Absolutely. The stories that are for the 3rd grade level or that level J are very complex. So they would go all the way to high school, especially if you've got kids with language difficulties. So absolutely, you can use it with all kids, depending on their language levels. So the clarification, somebody's asking me if they push into the kindergarten classroom 3 times a week, each day you should use a different story. And the answer is yes. You should use a different story because what you're going to end up doing is inadvertently teaching them that you have to memorize the story. And it's not recall of events or recall of the story events that matters. It's the meta-linguistic pieces of it. What would be better is if you went through the stories on a more basic level first, just focusing on story structure. And when your data says that these kids know story structure, then you go through them again, working on complex language and vocabulary. So several people asked about the older students, and I say absolutely. I recommend it for older kids who have language impairments, absolutely. The only caution would be some of the stories might be more relevant to young kids, but a lot of people have not, I mean, we don't hear from a lot of people that the stories are too cutesy or too babyish. So actually, somebody asked if we're going to do a webinar on story champs each month. So we just started these webinars just last month. So we would love to hear from you guys what you feel you need. And we're happy to do these. It's a very efficient way for us to kind of clarify some of these things because it is different. Like a story champ story is often implemented the way people are taught to read books, which is like the 3 times in a week, you know, you do these repeated readings, but there's reasons not to do that. And Story Champs is designed for a different type of instruction. It's actually designed to be way more efficient than that. And so this is a good venue to clarify some of these things. So I am absolutely excited to do more Story Champs webinars in the future, and we'll probably be more specific. This one was more of like, here's all the things it can do. So I'd love to do more in a later. Let's see. So yeah, this is a good question. Somebody's asking me a question about helping or using the text of the story to help children with autism. This is interesting. Now, and actually I have a ton of experience working with kids with autism, and they're the reason why I decided to go back and get my PhD, because I worked with so many kids with autism who could not understand what they were reading. And they couldn't answer questions, they couldn't answer WA questions, they couldn't retell a story. And that's what really interested me in this. And of course, it is their language comprehension deficits that are impairing their reading comprehension. Now, certainly if a child can comprehend what they read, then using the text is an effective prompt. However, you have to question, what is it that they can't do? And do we need to be working on listening comprehension in the absence of the text? that might be the weakness that you need to work on. So there's probably more that you and I could talk about that. And again, email me if you'd like to talk more specific about that situation, because it's an interesting one. And I would like to know more about how that's working for you, and whether the child can transfer to a listening comprehension task. Okay. So this next question is about how do I know focusing on the vocabulary words? So this is a good question. So we've done some research about the acquisition of the vocabulary words. So there's so much exposure to a vocabulary, 1 or 2, 3 words within a story, and that if they're practiced using it and they can define it, right? That's then and there. But they might have partial mastery of that vocabulary words. They really need to use it outside of that explicit instruction setting. They need to learn, or they need additional exposures to it. So 7 to 10 times is an exposure for a typical kid, but most of our kids who are at risk or what do I want to say? Have disabilities, they're going to need more exposures to it. And so we want to work on the Spot the Sparkle, or have them do the word journals, or that there's some sort of mechanism built in for review. Okay. And that's also a good reason why we would cycle the stories, as opposed to getting them, do them in the same week. If you come back 12 sessions later and review that same story, they're going to review the vocabulary words too. So listen, I just noticed, you guys got me talking. I just noticed that I'm 5 minutes late. So I'm going to end this really fast for those people who want to get off. Okay. So here are the kindergarten Common Core state standards that I just pulled out. I pulled out a handful of them. In the Common Core state standards, 41% of the English language arts standards are addressed by story champs. And these are just a handful of them. So 41%. The rest of them are things like decoding or phonics, letters and letter sounds, the rest of the things that are not addressed by story champs. And then, so I would consider that those standards are strong, and they are considered the building blocks for the later words, or sorry, the later tasks in standardized high stakes tests. And my conclusion is this, that Story Champs is designed and can and will help you get from oral language narrative all the way to state tests. And we have data to support that. I believe, Mike, did you include a link to our research summary or our reference list?
I'll add that to the chat room right now.
Right. Here's the research synthesis on Story Champs. And these are, I guess the studies that were completed, I don't know, a year ago or so. This is a 1-page research synthesis that covers all of the studies. Okay, we are to the end, and here is your discount code, webinar 15, if you're interested in purchasing something. And in just a second, I'll show you my email address. You're always welcome to email me. I love to hear from people in the field. I love to hear your questions, because it helps me make the program better for you the next time around. So please drop me an email. I'm happy to have a phone call with you to work through some of the questions that you have. That's a lot of fun for me. So please do that. All right. So webinar 15, I'm advancing this so you can see my email. And if you prefer to talk to Doug, I don't know why you would, but if you prefer to talk to Doug, there's his email too.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We are going to wrap up the webinar. I'm including a couple of notes here in the chat room, a couple links. We've got my email address if you have any questions. Also, again, the discount code and the link to the website. And we had a last question, which is, where is the link to this presentation? This webinar presentation will wrap up and then be posted on our website. Again, that's languagedynamicsgroup.com. Typically, it takes us about 2 or 3 days to post that, but you will see the link. So with that, again, we thank everyone for attending. Thank you, Dr. Trina Spencer, and we appreciate everything. Thank you. Goodbye.